Hello.
Hello, everybody. Well, welcome to our second live stream of the week. Uh, Probably the last one of the week, I hope. This is going to be our post-mortem for the dust storm that happened on October 31st and a little bit on the 30th. Uh, we've got a few folks today here to talk about that. Justin's going to kind of drive a lot of the conversation around the actual postmortem that we wrote up based on things, and then we're here to answer any questions you folks might have about all of this in response to what happened. And to those watching on YouTube, Zoom just did the thing that it does on me where it screws up and drops the video when I change. So give me one quick second here while I hate Zoom. I really hate Zoom. When I added Mariano to the call, it changed the process, so now it doesn't match anymore. Oh, one second here. Zoom, um, Zoom webinar. There we go. All right. Now you're all on YouTube. There we go. All right, everybody. Good morning. I'm going to remind you all that you're muted.
Well, good morning, everybody.
Morning, morning. So yeah, if we're not going to stand on ceremony, I can share my screen and start the presentation.
Sure.
Cool. Just want to make sure everybody can see the postmortem document here that I'm sharing. Yes?
Looks good.
Okay, cool. So this is a an event that was caused a lot of consternation in our community. The end of October, there was a dust storm where some unknown actor they began sending a large volume of transactions to the mainnet blockchain. Um, the first couple sorties they sent were smaller spikes in traffic and for shorter periods of time. We can't assess like motive there, but we assume that those were like in fencing, those were the tests to see kind of what our defenses were like. And then later on the 31st, they actually kind of kicked everything into high gear. I'll avoid reading this rote, but I'll give you a general summary of what it is. And if anybody is interested in going and reading the actual document, it's up on GitHub now. It has been posted to our postmortem repository, which we can link in the announcements channel once we're done here. So as I mentioned, there were two spikes of traffic early in the day on Saturday the 30th. The first one was kind of small. The second one was a little bit relatively larger. Both times we noticed some issues on the blockchain, ascribed it to maybe reorganization because there were nodes that couldn't keep up and peers were reorganizing and things like that. They weren't widespread and we weren't super concerned. It was things we kind of made a note to, let's revisit this Monday and see what we can do to make improvements and what can we get out of the metrics that we've been gathering this weekend. On the 31st, it became quickly apparent that this was a concern and we needed to address it very quickly. And so kind of we changed gears on Sunday when the traffic climbed pretty precipitously to immediately addressing the concerns and began working in earnest to build engineering solutions to kind of mitigate the things we were seeing coming out of the logs in real time. The impacts we were seeing were, as I mentioned, the lower power nodes were having trouble processing blocks and transactions, and so they were falling behind or off of the chain entirely. We were seeing nodes with the inability to propagate blocks if their peers were very low power, and a lot of their peers were also having trouble. We were also seeing that signage points were arriving late pretty much across the network. And that was a general symptom that wasn't apparent for everyone, but was apparent for some larger pockets. And so that was one of the big symptoms that kind of keyed us into this was a larger impact than the first two. That signage point thing really kicked off on Sunday when a far larger amount of nodes were starting to be impacted. We also had two smaller symptoms where, as I mentioned, block propagation was slower, and so some third-party apps and things like that were having trouble propagating blocks that they were creating, as well as proofs being missed as part of that missed signage point and partial point that I addressed earlier. There was also kind of the elephant in the room here, transaction fees. There was transaction pressure for the first time in the history of our blockchain. This was not expected. It's not that we weren't prepared for it. We certainly had the machinery in place to accept fees to do transactions. I think probably one of the things that we struggle with a little bit is initially getting the message out to the peers in the ecosystem to say, hey, you should probably start accepting fees. But once we kind of got together and started communicating, it was pretty quickly propagated throughout the ecosystem that fees would be required during this dust storm, and probably a good thing to add anyway, because this isn't going to be the end of fee pressure on the network. Ideally, this is just like a preview of what traffic looks like under load. And so while it was early, it was kind of an aggressive load test, and certainly it wasn't a friendly transaction sortie, but I think we handled it pretty well. And the main concerns that cropped up from this, we were able to address pretty quickly with the release of 1.2.11. The one exception being that Plot NFT fees are still not in. That was a concession to time of releasing the other improvements. The Plot NFT change will be in 1.2.12. We didn't want to rush out an untested change. And so that's why that change isn't in the larger group of changes. Also want to touch that there are more improvements coming. This isn't the end of our improvements here. This is just the stuff we got out very quickly because we felt it was the largest impact and would help the largest number of peers remain on the network. All told, there was about 5 exabyte of farmer space that was unable to farm during the peak of the dust storm, which is not ideal. That is a percentage of our consensus. However, it was not a large portion, and we were able to get those nodes back with the 1.2.11 patch, as well as when the dust storm kind of mitigated, those nodes were able to catch up, and kind of the ecosystem was able to return to normal, which was promising. You'll see here in this timeline, actually, that as we cleared transactions after the sorties went through, it wasn't a super long time. Transactions ended to the mempool being back to 0. I think we were clearing them at a rate about 20 transactions per second. And correct me if I'm wrong there, gentlemen. I can go through this long form timeline, but the key highlights here, we added the block heights here because that was something I thought was pretty interesting. We were able to dive into the database and grab that for you, so you have an actual on-chain time for this. We noticed at 1:55 Pacific time, so that was about 2 p.m. or about 3 p.m. my time here in Mountain Time. There was an alarm that went off on Saturday the 30th. That's what keyed us in to start looking at this stuff. So transactions had run for a little over an hour in the dust storm to start ramping up and filling the mempool. I'm surprised we didn't see these alarms sooner. And frankly, we tuned them a little bit better now. So we will get the alerts sooner now, ideally. And that was one thing that we kind of identified as a blind spot out of my team, was that these alarms probably would have been ideal for them to fire sooner. However, they did fire pretty shortly after the transaction started, and we were able to start immediately diagnosing the problem. There were two waves of transactions on Saturday. One started at 15:48, or I'm sorry, at 12:45. It peaked at 15:48 at about 1,750 transactions in the mempool, and then at about 16:02, the mempool was back to 0. And then at 1800, another wave started. That peaked at about 2,800 transactions at 22:22 Pacific time, and then at 2300, the mempool was empty again. So that was a pretty solid rate of clearing transactions, even with the network in kind of a scattered state. The final and largest wave of the dust storm began at 3:30 in the morning Pacific time, Sunday morning. I don't believe that this was an accidental choice. I'm glad that we took the time and had the alerts on Saturday, so we didn't have to have a 4 a.m. fire drill on Sunday. We did, however, have some engineers online, and they immediately began diagnosing the concerns and gathering metrics. We had discussed the day before kind of what to do if things showed up again. These guys were Johnny on the spot, so really great job of my colleagues there. At about 6 a.m., we had the team roused and we were like, hey, this is kind of serious. We should start working on this. By noon, we had a plan in place to say, these are the optimizations we think are important. And we were starting the idea of, we're going to do an emergency patch this week. Who needs to handle what? The senior engineers kind of carved out the things that they could own to kind of deliver them as quickly as possible. It was a really great job by the team to come together and kind of find solves for this, especially with the relatively short amount of information we were able to gather. I mean, we have pretty strong metrics, but it was a small sample size. So to be able to get actionable changes out of that was really impressive. So at 13:30 that Sunday, which is 1 o'clock in the afternoon, there were the first peak of about 5,100 transactions. You then see a dip in the graph to go down to about 4,250 transactions. I believe they backed off or had some failures in their nodes. That's complete guess on my end, but it kind of jives with what happens at 2:54 a.m. that they peak the transactions again. They ramped them back up very clearly to about 5,750 transactions. At about 4:46 a.m., the mempool was empty again after that last peak. It seems like the dust storm or whoever they were had achieved what they were looking to achieve and ended their transaction storm. Either that or they didn't see the results they were looking for and trying to fill the mempool very full. At no point did this 5750 approach anywhere near what the configured maximum was. However, it is concerning to see all of the issues we saw at that level, and so that's why we took the very serious actions that we did. At 10 a.m. that Monday, about 5 hours after the transaction pool had been back to zero, we had planning in place for the emergency patch with a planned release of 11.3. We missed that. I will need to update this doc. There's a graph. One moment, I will grab it and share it with you guys. I'm not sure why that's not linked to. I apologize for that. I will fix that in a moment. Give me a second to get this graph open for you.
While you get that fixed, Mariano, he can go through the root cause and then the recovery part.
Sure. So first, I'd like to explain how the blockchain works, so people can more deeply understand the issues that happen. So the blockchain alternates between blocks and signage points. So each node has a database where they store their blocks and they store their signage points. So you might add a block and then maybe you get 5 signage points in order, and signage points come around every 9 seconds. So you might get 5 signage points and then you add another block and then another block and then another 3 signage points, etc. So it alternates between signage points and blocks. And the way propagation works is each node is connected to another random 10 nodes in the network. And it's not exactly random, but it's you can think of it as random. So when a new signage point gets created by a Time Lord, that node sends it to their peers, their 10 peers, or however many they have, and then each of their peers sends it to their peers, etc. So it might take like 5 or 6 hops to reach the whole network, but it quickly reaches it. Do you want to explain the graph really quick before I continue?
Yes. So as you can see, these are the kind of 3 waves we mentioned. There's that first sortie on Sunday, the second sortie on Sunday later, and then here's the big shebang that kicks off very early in the morning Sunday. As you can see, this is about 5,750 transactions was the peak of everything, and we very quickly kind of drops off a cliff as soon as the transactions stop. We're able to clear them. And this will be published with the document. Apologies for not having that prepared. Go ahead, Mariano.
Yes, so objects get propagated through the network, but each node sending it to their peers and each peer sending it to their peers, etc. So that's signage points. Blocks are the same way. If I'm a node and I farm a block, I send that to my peers, and each one of those peers, each one of those nodes verifies the block. And that requires checking that all the transactions in that block are valid. And then after verifying it and after adding it to the blockchain, they send it to their peers. So there is a little bit of a delay between when you receive it and when you send it to your peers, because you have to verify it. If it takes less than a second, it's not an issue because it's very quick. You verify it and then you send it, and the whole network will have it in less than 6 or 7 seconds. However, if blocks take a really long time to validate, let's say a block takes 30 seconds to validate, then they will take much longer to reach the whole network, right? Because each layer is going to add another 30 seconds of latency, etc. So block propagation times are really important. What happens if blocks come out slowly? What happens if blocks get propagated slowly? Well, when you receive a block, you add it to your blockchain, and then you process the signage points after that block. But you cannot process the signage points that came after that block until you have that block and you process it. So if you're a farmer, remember that farmers get the signage points every 9 seconds and then check if they have a proof on their plots. But you cannot process the signage points until you have that block. And if you receive that block like a minute late, a minute after it was created, then you're farming those signage points like a minute later than you should be farming them. And you only have 28 seconds approximately to farm a signage point, right? To check your plots. So that means that if you're receiving a block really late, you're not going to be farming properly, because by the time you farmed and you checked if you won, the whole network has moved on to the next height and it's too late to farm those blocks. So what happened in this incident? Well, someone sent a bunch of transactions, right? They had a node and they created like hundreds and thousands of transactions on their local node. That node sent them to their peers, etc. And then the transactions got propagated through the network, same as other things get propagated. However, nodes were so busy accepting these transactions that they were kind of going slower. They were not prioritizing validation of blocks. So if I'm a node, I validate like 100 transactions per second, and then I pause the block validation. So my block validation, instead of taking 1 second, it can take like 20 seconds because I'm too busy doing the other stuff, the transaction processing. And that includes IO time. So you might be reading the database to check if transactions are valid. So your database reads become much slower in block validation, and also CPU time. And because they have to share the CPU time between validating blocks and validating transactions. And finally, there are certain locks. So a lock is when some parts of the code can run, but other parts of the code are paused. They're kind of waiting for the other parts of the code. And some inefficiency in the locks means that the block validation code was kind of waiting, right? It was waiting for the transactions to process. So all these transactions caused block validation to be slow, and that caused block propagation times through the network to be slow. And that means some people were not able to farm properly. Also, since the mempool was getting filled, since blocks were full, you would need a fee to get included into the next block, because it's kind of a market supply demand kind of thing, where if you want to get included into the next block, you need to be one of the top fee payers, right, to be included. So that meant that people that were paying with 0 fees were not able to get their transaction included quickly. They had to wait until the whole queue of transactions got through. And this caused issues with people that were using pooling, for example, changing pools, or the pools themselves that were trying to send payments to their users. They didn't have any fees on those transactions, as well as the pool claiming rewards from the blockchain. So any transaction with 0 fee was taking a long time to go through. So those are some issues that we saw because fees became necessary here. So let me talk about the recovery then. Well, the problem kind of resolved itself after the attacker, or the dust stormer, however you want to call them, stopped making the transactions. However, we did want to address these issues so that the network can handle these transactions. It should be able to handle all of these transactions and continue with no issues. So we looked at a lot of different things. How can we improve block validation? How can we make it faster? And how can we make it so that blocks are always prioritized over transactions? So we kind of made some changes where the node always validates blocks first. No matter how many transactions are coming in, blocks get priority. that reduces competition for I/O, for reading and writing the database, and also for CPU. Then we also added a transaction queue. So when transactions come in, they go into the queue instead of just being validated immediately, because there was a lot of competition for the validation there. So the transaction queue streamlined this process and made it much simpler, and there's a max size of the queue. So we dropped some transactions if there are way too many that we cannot process. For example, if you're in a really slow Raspberry Pi with maybe a slow disk, there's a limit to how many transactions per second you can validate. So your node might drop some transactions if it's completely overwhelmed. Also, we added some more parallelism and caching with regards to transactions and signatures to speed those up. And we removed some of the locks to prevent different parts of code from waiting when they didn't have to wait. Finally, we made some changes to the mempool, because your whole mempool has to be reprocessed after each block to make sure the transactions are still valid. So we made that much more efficient. So with all these changes, we think that if the dust storm comes again, it's going to be much better this time, and it won't cause farming issues. We did some tests on Testnet. Justin can explain those. And there are still some issues that we need to address. For example, slow drives. If the drive is really slow, the database can still take multiple seconds to add a block. So that is an issue that we want to address sooner rather than later, because in my opinion, it's the main bottleneck for block validation. And once we make these changes, I think even low-end machines will have a much better time with full blocks. Yeah, that's it.
Awesome. Thank you for that nice intro, Mariano. So yes, we did immediately the Monday morning following the dust storm, we began improving our practice of testing transaction density in the mempool and in other parts of the testnet infrastructure. It's something we had always intended to do. You hear this story a lot. We made decisions based on what we thought were the most value we could put was, and clearly that was something we should have invested in sooner. So we immediately turned around and got this up. It's a collaboration between the DevOps and the engineering team. We were able to put together a pretty strong dust storm bot. So we began testing on Monday the 21st, and I'll show you guys the graph of what our tests look like. And I'll zoom in here so you can see. You'll see that when we began, so this is a test pattern we began on the 3rd. I think it's the nicest looking one because it's where we hit the peak. We have a bunch of other graphs like this from the mempool from Testnet as well. But as you see, when we really got it kicked off, it was at about 10,000. We made some further changes to it. We hit about 45,000. And then we peaked here around 65,000 transactions in the mempool was the peak we were able to generate. And so you'll notice that is a lot more transactions than the initial dust storm was able to run. So we feel very strongly that the testing we were able to do during that week while we were building the emergency 1211 release was a heavier load than was being generated on production, and these instances on the 1211 versus their peers that were on the lower software versions that we were testing on Testnet as well, were performing far better. So we're very confident in our testing practice having been improved, and that we were able to emulate far heavier load than we saw on mainnet, so that we're very confident in these changes.
In short, that test was like, what, 12 times the amount of?
Yeah, like 11.3 times or something like that, yeah.
Yeah, there's one caveat to that, which we are continuing to investigate, which is that network latency and the types of machines involved can add an extra element of confusion to this test process. So even though we've hit it, quote, harder, we did not necessarily yet have a good way to mirror the, it takes 6 seconds to get around the world kind of problem. Yeah. I know that Justin is on that.
I covered this a little bit in a Chia forum post where we discussed this, and people asked about our testing, and I'm sure this will come up in the Q&A after this, but it's one thing to test it with the load. It's another to test it on the actual real world hardware. And that's the part that, we can only test so much. We can't create 400,000 nodes of actual hardware to test on.
Right.
And I'm doing my best to emulate it. And the thing that's hard for me to emulate, to be honest with you, is low-end devices on less than good internet connection. Like if you are on a standard commercial or a standard home internet connection, I can't really emulate that with any of the co-location space I can buy. And so that's something we've been having to get a little bit creative with, but we do have patterns we're building.
You could just fill a cargo container full of pies and drive it out to the middle of the desert and hook it up to a DSL line.
Well, and I want everyone to know that, you know, every engineer or engineering close individual on the team has a Pi bought by the company so that they have an environment to run our code in. The only problem we run into, of course, is that we all have good internet.
Yeah. So we actually, I have been discussing it kind of with a few community members actually, and they have had some really cool ideas on how to emulate or simulate spotty internet, how to simulate different speeds of broadband and things like that. So we have some better test patterns we're going to be putting in as well. We're definitely not done by any stretch of the imagination.
So we do have some questions built into the postmortem thing. If we don't get a lot of questions, we might read through some of these to kind of cover them, but I don't want to just sit here and read a doc for you guys. That's kind of boring. First, if people have questions, if you're on the Zoom call, put them in the Q&A box. Again, like always, don't put them in chat. Please put them in the Q&A box. If you're on the YouTube chat, if you're not in Zoom and only on YouTube, then go ahead and put them in the YouTube chat, and I'll try to find those and pull those out. With that said, the first question we got over there was, do we know how much Chia was actually spent by the person responsible? I think we did some basic napkin math. Do one of you guys remember the number? I think it comes up to like a Chia, right? Doesn't it? It wasn't that much.
Yeah, it was. I think it was actually less than a whole Chia. It was like most of a Chia broken up into Mojo.
Yeah, because I think we did the math. It was like 1.52 million transactions total, and so a Mojo is a trillionth of a Chia. So yeah.
But where were those Chia sent? Were they sent to the same address? Because if that's the case, then no Chia was spent.
Yeah, it may be that no Chia was spent.
I believe not. I believe because I remember. I have to double check, but I remember people commenting about the fact they were getting random Mojos during that day appearing on their wallets, and it was all said and done. Not everyone, but some people were getting like a Mojo here, a Mojo there. I got no free Mojos, sadly.
If you look at the graph again, there were clearly different, like, this is a casting aspersions, but if I were doing a dust storm, I would have, after that first couple tests, as you're there, you probably would have changed things, and maybe one of the patterns they used towards the end was sending Mojo to other people's wallets to see if that would have an impact. Mm-hmm. So I think that we're going to see kind of some unexplainable behavior, but you can kind of make intelligent guesses at it, and that's probably what that was. And they probably didn't spend a whole lot, because I don't think we had a whole lot of reports of mysterious Mojo appearing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I'd like to throw a question in just because I think it's illustrative. Mariano, when we launched on May 3rd, we locked the total block size to 35% of its kind of architected size. Can you talk through why we did that?
Yes. So to explain exactly what that is, although the block size is set at 11 million cost is like total amount of stuff your transaction can do. 11 billion for the whole block. We limited it so that farmers only make blocks up to 50% of that, and usually less than 50, but about 50%. So if you're a farmer, you're going to be making blocks that are only up to like 5.5 billion in cost. And that can be increased by the farmers themselves, or it can be increased by an update up to the full limit. So we capped it at half the size because we didn't do thorough enough testing before launching, and we didn't want these kind of problems to happen. So we kind of set it to lower than we think we can eventually reach, just while our software is being developed and improved. And as we improve it further, we will increase that limit further to increase the total transactions per second that the chain can handle. But since the software is new and still under development and under a lot of changes, we limited the total size of the blocks.
Great. And I just want to point out, I'd said on Twitter that we sustained 25 TPS of these transactions. It was actually about 24 over the long haul, so very close to that. Now, these transactions aren't necessarily illustrative of what normal transactions will look like. So you can't just say, hey, this is a 50 TPS chain per se. But it does imply that we might be in the 30s to 40 TPS actually as designed. And, just to echo what Mariano was saying, we took the conservative view of, especially early on, we would keep block size a little lower because we knew we had more work to do around optimizations of how Python works on the Pi and those other things. And obviously had other things we needed to focus on, like, our recent project for the World Bank, what we're about to go set off and do with Costa Rica. So, important competing solutions there, but we knew that was a conservative thing. And I think ultimately, when you look at the amount of space that stayed online and kept farming, and the fact that the chain kept moving, that was a smart move. And that smart move made sure that we didn't have any more problem than we did, and that we're going to be, further addressing things we know are problems. So, we talked about the database. I'll also say that there's even a hint internally that the database may be cut in half in total size. Can't guarantee that. No promises. We have not put a lot of effort yet into the blockchain DB. We've learned that the blockchain DB has some weird expensive behavior on spinning disks and other places. So I think it's implementation details that we're going to get better and continue to optimize. So,
and to follow in Gene's part about, we may be making the database smaller now that we have not yet put efforts into working on that, and now we're looking at it. One of the questions in this document that you guys can read online that we actually had, that we were commonly asked, was, all these optimizations we did, why weren't they launched with that in the first place? Well, why did we have to go? Why are we doing optimizations at all? And something I've harped on a lot in this, as we talked about this with the public, is that with software development, there's always optimizations you can do. Always. You have to decide, do we ship something that's good enough now, or do you sit on it till it's 100% ready? And if you wait for it to be 100% ready, it's going to come out months or years or never. And so you release something that you're confident in, that you can improve what you're confident in, and then you go back and you improve it iteratively over time. Ideally, you improve it faster than those improvements are needed. And we have a plan for how to go back and do things like decrease the database size and improve other things. But they weren't something that we had to do now. They were something we thought we had to do over the next year. And then we had a simulated load of what our load would look like a year or two from now that required us to do it now. And that's why.
And along that note, does somebody want to speak to what the new recommended min spec would be?
Yeah, I think I can take that. So because of what we've learned about the database and potentially even the logs as well, we'd recommend that you do not use your Chia directory on a Pi 4 on the SD card, but instead have it on actual SSD. Those are relatively inexpensive. That will perform much better. We are saying use a Pi 4 4 gig with no GUI, and that we would recommend having at least 1 gigabyte of swap space just in case. So it's a slight upgrade to what we consider minimum hardware. But I think it's important that we continue to target the Pi. It is a important thing for our dev team, because a lot of folks here are, of course, using some of the best computers in the world to do their development on. And so those machines do not see these limitations and difficulties. And by targeting the Pi 4, it gives a good sense for everybody about what those requirements are, but it also really highlights that we have people using 10-year-old game PCs quite effectively to be farmer full nodes. And, that's exciting. It's part of why a lot of our partners, folks like the World Bank, like that it's accessible. It's accessible on used hardware, that, the non-OECD country citizens can easily be involved in this blockchain.
And one other, sorry, I was not one other thing, separate. New question that popped up in YouTube is that, during this event, the estimated time to win kept going up despite the netspace going down. And can we explain why that is and how that was calculated as a result? I'll let probably Mariano can probably have a good answer on that a bit. But the short answer is just the calculations take time. It's a rolling window of time. And so that rolling window, rolls behind the event. But I'm sure Mariano can explain that better.
Yeah, it's possible that since blocks were coming at more volatile times, since some blocks were getting dropped, some people weren't farming properly, that this caused some issues with the algorithm which computes the estimated time to win. So it wasn't really that accurate. And in cases where there's a lot of volatility in the total net space, then the algorithm is not fully accurate.
Cool, thanks. The person who asked the question about how much we thought was spent kind of followed up with the reason they asked that question was they were curious what it would cost to do this again. And the answer is exactly the way it was before, the same, assuming there is a cost and they aren't just recycling the Chia between their wallets, and that's a Chia. But the difference being now is that at the time, the ecosystem was not prepared for fees. People just weren't using them. They weren't necessary. And so a lot of things lacked fees. Pool transactions lacked fees. Some of our UI elements, like changing a plot NFT, lacked fees support. Like the fee support was there, but the UI element to do it wasn't there. Those are all there now. So if someone did this again, presumably the people who have transactions that they want to go through for legitimate reasons will attach a very small fee. The minimum fee, I think, is like what, 500 Mojo, I think, or 5,000 Mojo is the minimum fee. And so people will attach the minimum fee, and then the dust storm just gets relegated to the bottom of the list. It doesn't cause a problem. And if you do that, it will basically negate the issue almost entirely. And so if they wanted to do it the exact same way, it will cost less than a Chia. If they want to actually do something impactfully useful, they'll have to pay a notable fee on every single transaction. And now suddenly this is going to cost them many Chia. But with the optimizations we put in place, it ideally won't have any impact. So.
Yeah, also, the minimum fee that counts as a minimum fee was intentionally kind of set with the near term in mind. So it's effectively about 0.8 of a cent. People kind of worry about that. And the answer is that over time, should the fiat value of Chia go even higher to make that number too high, it's a pretty easy and not even a fork to change the defaults to use a smaller amount of Chia as the supposed minimum fee. So that's quite intentional and is adjustable over time to keep everybody kind of on the same page.
Another question we have, as a, I guess, design suggestion, is it possible for us in the client to have a suggested fee on the UI? So when users are actually doing transactions, if the network's busy, it just kind of suggests to them, hey, add a fee to make sure this goes through.
I'll take it. So we actually have an alpha fee estimator in-house. It is going to be going into the new Light wallet, and the new Light wallet is going to be merging back into the main Chia distribution. It has taken a slight backseat to merging back into the main Chia distribution and getting all the CATS features that you all have seen on the beta wallet working. So we're also, I believe, one or two places there's still not a place to add a fee. That has been stubbed out and will be out in the next 1 to 3 releases, basically. So, I think by the end of the year, certainly, but sooner, you'll probably have both a fee estimator and the ability to enter a fee in any of those various boxes. Also, important to note, we don't only have the UI to make it obvious, but for those of you who are a little more sophisticated, we support replace by fee, RBF, out of the box. So if you went out and sent a 0 Mojo transaction and it's not going through, you can update it with a fee. It'll replace in the mempool and go through.
Cool. There was one I just saw. Sorry, the YouTube chat decided to start suddenly scrolling much quicker now. Someone had commented on the fact that we keep talking about low-end hardware, and we've talked about the Pi 4 being our minimum spec, but they were asking about, do we have plans for supporting other types of low-end hardware like IoT devices and game consoles and stuff like that. I mean, Gene, you can probably talk about if you want to, but the answer is if it's better than a Pi 4, maybe.
Yeah, so we've seen people actually farm on Android devices. Fundamentally, we tried to keep the infrastructure capable of all that. At some point, though, you run into BLS signatures are expensive. Those are implemented in both C++ with some assembly components as well. There is some more optimization, especially for ARM64, that we're going to be doing around assembly instructions there too. One comment on this topic of the dust storm, the person actually responsible was kind of saying, it's all Python and it's bad. And it's actually not all Python. In fact, most of the components that matter are either C++ assembly or Rust. And it's just Python networking and Python network handling that we're primarily using Python for.
And following on that, someone did ask the question, what are our thoughts on the code that the Duster released in their interview with Chia Plot? Like, do we consider it legit? As in, is that actually what they use to do this? Is it?
I believe so. Yeah. I mean, look, there are better ways, but it is certainly solid Python code.
Which, interestingly, they complained about the fact that all our stuff is in Python when it's not, but yet they did their attack using Python.
Yeah.
Because it does the job that you want it to do in the cases where you use it pretty well.
Well, I don't think anyone hates Python more than people who write Python. That's
This is probably true.
I actually really like Python.
Yeah.
Okay, with the exception of Arcana.
Yeah. Yeah, if anybody ever asks, I mean, the thing we do look at is as we continue to profile and optimize, obviously we're adding assembly where we can for ARM64 and others, just because that's obviously one of the big paths forward from the CPU world. Also, we continue to look at Rust as a solution to other additional kind of performance issues. So if we're finding something in Python that we feel like is going to be a roadblock, we're generally thinking about how to turn that into something modular that we can put in Rust and call from Python. So that's generally kind of our approach.
I got a follow-up question for you, Gene, on when you talked about the ability to replace a transaction with the same transaction with a fee added. Is that something they want to know that is in other blockchain technologies, or is that unique to us?
It is not unique to us. Bitcoin is the original kind of grandfather of this feature. Now, I'm not sure of other chains that do that or not, but I can tell you that Bitcoin does, and it's an important feature to have. Longer term, we're probably going to have an entirely something that looks like mempoool.space, if you ever want to look at it, but in the client. So you can sit there and go, okay, how fast I want a transaction to get through. Do I need to change the fee? All of that kind of in real time.
Okay.
Something out. Some blockchains actually have no replace by fee as a feature. So your transaction goes into the mempool and it's essentially locked in there, which means it's guaranteed to be confirmed. But that's not really a secure feature, which is why we went with replace by fee as the default and the way that all transactions should work.
Okay. We've gotten a couple questions on, if we actually know who did this. We kind of have ideas. There's been some speculation, but honestly, we don't, and we're not trying to find out. We don't really care, and I don't mean that in a dismissive way of yeah, we don't care who it is. No, we don't care because learning who did this doesn't actually benefit us in any way. It's they did what they did. They said why they did it, which may or may not be why, but they've said why they did it, and they did what they did, and we addressed it, and they didn't hack Chia's corporate network. They didn't get access to secret information or our files. There's no sense in pursuing the matter, really.
I want to underline this. I'm very confident that the person that talked to Chris Dupree at chiaplot.net was the person in question. Mm-hmm. But again, it's an open, decentralized network. This is actually a legitimate use of it. So that's why you don't hear us, every so often the word attack slips in. I prefer that we don't even say that. It is someone using the blockchain as designed. It was a good stress test. And, ultimately we passed that stress test for the core, but we would have liked it to have been even better. And that's why you're, sitting here hearing from us, what are we going to do to make sure that we can get even better and ultimately relax the 50% block restriction here in the next quarter or two.
In fact, during the very first wave that happened, there was some speculation going on internally. We were like, what is this? Is this one of the many partners we have announced or are going to announce? Are they just secretly doing a stress test and didn't tell us? At first we were kind of like, this is interesting, because it was like Gene said, it was just it's traffic, right? It wasn't an attack. It was just traffic. Looking through, I don't think there's any other specific questions that have been asked that we haven't answered. If you guys do have any questions that we haven't answered, please put them in the Q&A thing on Zoom or in YouTube chat. Otherwise, we're going to start kind of wrapping up here shortly. We got a question here just came in. Yeah,
I can address the question.
Right.
If we're planning on re-implementing the blockchain.
State the question first.
Yeah, the question is, why would another dust storm cost more Chia? Isn't it possible to fill up the mempool with zero cost transactions?
Go ahead, Mariano.
Yeah, it's possible to perform a dust storm attack with very little Chia, and you can just send the Chia to yourself. The thing is, the blockchain and the node should be able to handle these attacks with no problems, right? They shouldn't cause any issues with farming. They shouldn't cause any delays for users making transactions, etc. Basically, people can make attacks, can make dust storm attacks, and nothing happens. That's the goal. So it doesn't really matter how much it costs. It could be free, but it doesn't matter. So what can someone do if they're attacking with a lot of transactions? What they can do is they can fill the blockchain with a certain fee, and then everyone must pay that fee to get included into the blockchain. So they can basically set a fee floor. However, that is very, very expensive. If you want to do it for a whole day, that's going to cost tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. I'm not sure. It might be even millions of dollars. So it's not really practical to do this kind of attack because you have to spend more and more. If you're just doing zero fee transactions like the dust storm did initially, then that's not going to cause any issues because anyone can just put a 1 cent fee and get included immediately. So we're not really worried about these kind of attacks as long as the performance of the node is sufficient to handle them, right? And that's what we've been working on, and we're still working on. But yeah, so I wouldn't worry too much about these attacks as long as performance is sufficient.
And I'd add that if somebody wanted to do a minimum fee attack, that it would be a very nice donation to all the farmers that day.
Yeah, the farmers would be very happy to get some fees out of their transactions, I'm quite certain.
That's
right. That about does it, I think, for the questions we have related to the dust storm. I don't think I missed any, so that's all that's come through. So a little bit early instead of our usual running 5 minutes over like we always do. So thanks everyone for coming. We know a lot of you had questions not related to this, and you had questions yesterday not related to cats. We are going to try to do another AMA here soon. We're going to do at least one before the end of the year with multiple holidays in the U.S. coming up between Thanksgiving and Christmas breaks and all that kind of stuff. Scheduling is kind of tricky to get the right folks in the right times, but we're going to do at least one more before the end of the year as a generic overall AMA. So we'll get all those kind of questions then. I'm also going to try to find some time to do a more asynchronous, like all day long AMA on Reddit here, hopefully in December at some point for you guys as well. So we'll get to all those kind of questions and stuff then, hopefully. Thanks everybody for coming. And we'll see you all next time.